The air in the tent is thick with the scent of dried resin and the lingering heat of a desert night that refuses to break. Outside, the vast, silent expanse of the Canaanite plateau stretches toward an infinite horizon. But inside, the atmosphere is heavy with the weight of an inheritance that will span millennia. Imagine, if you will, an old man, his eyes clouded by time, yet sharp with the piercing clarity of foresight, sitting on a simple rug of woven wool. This is Jacob, the man who wrestled with the celestial, the man whose descendants are not merely a family, but a prophecy in motion. He is calling his sons to his side, 12 men, each forged by different mothers, each carrying a different spirit, each a seed that will sprout into a nation. Look closely at them. Do you see brothers? Or do you see the foundations of a civilization that would eventually command the attention of every corner of the globe? We often speak of the 12 tribes as if they were a monolith, a singular block of marble carved from history. But they were anything but. They were a kaleidoscope of temperament, ambition, and regional soul. To understand the collapse that was to come, we must first understand the volatile, brilliant, and deeply human alchemy that brought them together in the first place. Consider the mothers. The house of Jacob was a tapestry woven from the distinct threads of Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah. These were not just names in an ancient ledger. They were the architects of tribal identity. The sons of Leah, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun were the heavy, foundational stones. They carried the burden of the firstborn, the intensity of the priesthood, and the crown of royalty. When you speak of Judah, you are speaking of the lion, the diplomat, the leader who would eventually hold the standard for the entire lineage. Yet, in these early days, he was one of a discordant chorus of siblings, struggling for the favor of a father whose heart was famously complex. Then, there were the sons of the beloved Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. If the sons of Leah were the sturdy walls of the house, the sons of Rachel were the windows, letting in the light of providence and the sharp cold of hardship. Joseph, the dreamer, the one sold into the distant unknown of Egypt, became the bridge between the nomadic tribe and the ancient superpower of the Nile. His story is the ultimate study in resilience, a transformation that allowed the tribes to survive a famine that threatened to erase them from the map. It was Joseph who secured their future, but it was also Joseph who, by elevating his own sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, into the tribal fold, fundamentally altered the geography of the nation. But the alchemy did not stop there. The sons of the handmaids, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, brought the raw, untamed energy of the periphery. They were the scouts, the defenders of the borders, the ones who lived where the desert touched the sown land. Each tribe developed a character as distinct as the landscape they occupied. The Zebulunites, settled by the coast, became the masters of trade and the sea, their eyes always fixed on the horizon, while the men of Issachar were the scholars and the diligent stewards, finding value in the quiet labor of the earth. This, however, was their great paradox. They were bound by the most fragile of threads, a shared ancestor and a singular, invisible God. Imagine the scene at the base of the mountains, where the tribes first gathered. They were not a nation-state with a central bureaucracy or a standing army. They were a confederation of distinct clans, held together solely by the covenant. Their identity was not defined by a king, for they had none. It was not defined by a permanent border, for they were constantly shifting. It was defined by the tabernacle, that mobile, shimmering tent that housed the presence of the infinite. Whenever the cloud moved, they moved. Whenever the silver trumpets sounded, 12 distinct banners, each with its own insignia, would rise into the desert wind. A lion for Judah, a bull for Ephraim, a wolf for Benjamin. It was a beautiful, precarious order. They lived in the tension between their individual autonomy and their collective destiny. They were 12 distinct notes in a chord that, when played together, created a symphony of monotheism that was completely alien to the surrounding empires, who bowed before idols of stone and gold. Yet, even in these early, idyllic days, the fault lines were visible. The rivalry between the sons of the handmaids and the sons of the matriarchs was a current running beneath the surface. The deep-seated jealousy that had once led them to cast their own brother into a pit was never fully buried. It was merely quieted by the sheer necessity of survival. They were a family trying to become a nation, and in that process, they carried with them the seeds of their own future splintering. As we look at them standing there, the wind whipping their mantles, each one reflecting a different facet of the human experience, we have to ask ourselves, how does such a diverse group remain one? How does the scholar find common cause with the warrior? How does the trader from the coast look into the eyes of the shepherd from the hills and see himself? For a time, the answer was the covenant. It was a shared promise that they were part of something greater than their own tribal interests. It was the belief that their strength lay in their diversity, that together they were a reflection of a higher order. But beneath this noble exterior, the human element, the ego, the hunger for status, the regional pride, was always waiting for a moment of weakness. The stage was set, the geography was carved out, the identities were forged in the fires of survival. They were ready to enter the land, to plant their feet in the soil of Canaan, and to begin the great experiment of living as a holy nation. They did not know, as they marched toward the horizon, that the very diversity that made them strong would eventually become the gravity pulling them toward their own shadow. The 12 tribes were a miracle in progress, a testament to the power of a shared vision. And yet, they were also a fragile glass, waiting for the first hammer of history to strike. The throne of Solomon was not merely a seat of cedar and gold. It was the apex of an experiment that had defied the gravity of history. For a brief, shimmering moment in the ancient world, the 12 tribes were no longer merely a confederation of nomadic clans dancing around a tent. They were a singular, imperial power. The sound of the chisels carving the stones for the great temple in Jerusalem echoed the harmony of a people finally united under one banner, one law, and one center of gravity. Yet, success is a treacherous architect. It builds monuments that cast long, cold shadows, and in those shadows, the seeds of fracture were quietly germinating. To understand the unraveling, one must look not at the external empires circling the borders, but at the internal architecture of the kingdom itself. Solomon, in his pursuit of grandeur, had transformed the pastoral simplicity of his father's reign into a sophisticated, bureaucratic machine. But machines require fuel, and in the ancient world, that fuel was the labor and the coin of the people. Jerusalem, the city of gold, began to loom over the other tribes not as a fraternal heart, but as an insatiable maw. The northern tribes, with their fertile plains and their long tradition of fierce, rugged independence, began to view the splendor of the South with a mixture of awe and growing resentment. The tension was not immediate. It was a slow, creeping erosion of trust. It was the feeling of being an afterthought in one's own nation. The northern clans, Ephraim and Manasseh at their core, felt the weight of the crown's heavy hand pressing upon their industries and their ancestral lands. They saw their resources flowing south to sustain a royal lifestyle that felt increasingly detached from the sweat of the northern soil. The covenant that had once united them, the invisible, sacred tether, was being replaced by the visible, crushing reality of taxation and mandatory service. When Solomon finally passed into the silence of history, the dam of patience broke. His son, Rehoboam, inherited a kingdom that was a polished facade hiding a hollow interior. He was faced with a pivotal choice: to listen to the weary echoes of his people's concerns or to tighten the iron grip of his authority. In the halls of power, the council was divided. The elders, those who had seen the fragility of the peace, urged mercy, suggesting that a lighter hand would secure the future. But the voices of the young courtiers, intoxicated by the intoxicating fragrance of absolute power, urged arrogance. They convinced the king that to show empathy was to show weakness. The confrontation at Shechem remains one of the most poignant turning points in the story of civilization. It was there, amidst the rolling hills of the north, that the tribes gathered to voice their grievance. When the king delivered his ultimatum, a promise to increase the burden rather than alleviate it, the response was not one of submission, but of absolute, chilling silence. Then, the cry erupted, "What portion have we in David? To your tents, O Israel!" In that single moment, the tapestry was torn. It was not a chaotic riot. It was a cold, calculated severance. The 10 tribes of the north, in a breathtaking act of political defiance, turned their backs on the house of David. The kingdom fractured along the very lines that had once been the strength of their diversity. The north, with its vast expanse and military potential, became the kingdom of Israel, while the south, anchored by Judah and the loyalists of Benjamin, became the kingdom of Judah. The division was more than political. It was existential. The north, feeling the need to establish its own legitimacy and to prevent its people from returning to the magnetic pull of the Jerusalem temple, began to construct its own centers of worship. This was the beginning of a profound spiritual drift. By creating new symbols, they were attempting to anchor their own identity, but they were also isolating themselves from the foundational vision that had brought them out of the desert. The two kingdoms became like brothers who, after a lifetime of shared struggle, suddenly found themselves strangers in the same house. The northern kingdom, while geographically larger and more affluent, entered a period of relentless instability. Without the unifying anchor of the Davidic dynasty, it became a stage for a dizzying succession of leaders, each rising on the promise of reform and falling under the weight of political infighting. The North began to mirror the world around it, adopting the customs and the syncretistic beliefs of the surrounding nations to secure alliances and trade. The Southern Kingdom, meanwhile, retreated into a defensive posture, clinging to the memory of the Golden Age. Judah became a fortress of tradition, fiercely guarding its heritage but also becoming increasingly rigid. The two nations, once the limbs of a singular body, were now locked in a cycle of suspicion and skirmish. As the years ground on, the internal decay was matched by the encroaching shadows of the superpowers of the age. Assyria, a colossus of iron and ambition, began its steady, rhythmic march across the plains. The Northern Kingdom, weakened by its internal fractures and its shift away from its core identity, stood in the path of a storm it was no longer equipped to weather. The tragedy was not merely that they were outmatched in strength, but that they had lost the invisible, unifying spirit that had once made them untouchable. They had become a house divided, and in the logic of history, a house divided against itself cannot stand when the whirlwind begins to howl. The stage was now set for the final act, where the fractured pieces would be swept away into the vast, silent archives of the unknown. The winds of history rarely whisper. They howl, sweeping away the monuments of men and the borders of empires until all that remains is the dust of what we once called absolute truth. We began this journey with a family of 12, a collection of unique temperaments and shared dreams. Bound by a covenant that promised a future of light, we watched as they built a kingdom, a golden age that dared to stand against the tide of antiquity, only to see it splinter under the weight of ego and the slow, corrosive acid of resentment. Then, we witnessed the silence, the chilling, profound silence of the North, as 10 tribes were gathered by the relentless march of the Assyrian machine and scattered into the vast, indifferent tapestry of the ancient world. But why does this vanishing act still haunt us? Why do we, thousands of years removed from the plains of Samaria, still feel the phantom limb of those missing brothers? The answer lies in the realization that the tragedy of the lost tribes is not merely a historical footnote, but a mirror held up to the human condition. When we look at the dissolution of those 10 tribes, we are seeing the ultimate consequence of forgetting the glue that binds us. They chose the path of the ephemeral, the shifting sands of political convenience, and the glitter of foreign altars, over the enduring strength of their shared purpose. They traded the depth of their roots for the breadth of their influence, and in doing so, they lost the one thing that made them a nation, their soul. Yet, there is a haunting beauty in this loss. History is not a closed book. It is a river that carries the sediment of everything it has ever touched. The tribes may have vanished from the maps, but they did not evaporate from the collective consciousness. They became a symbol, a resonant frequency in the human heart that speaks to our deep, primal need to belong, to be part of a lineage, and to be recognized by our peers. Every time a community struggles to maintain its identity in the face of an overwhelming, homogenizing force, the story of the tribes is playing out once again. Every time we grapple with the tension between our individual ambitions and the greater good, we are walking the same ground that Jacob's sons once traversed. Think of the legacy they left behind. It was not in the stones of their palaces or the gold in their treasuries, which have long since been reclaimed by the earth. Their true monument is the ethical blueprint they etched into the bedrock of Western civilization. The concepts of justice, of the intrinsic dignity of the individual, and of a moral law that transcends the whims of any ruler. These were the fires they kept burning. Even when the northern kingdom succumbed to the darkness of exile, the light they had carried was not extinguished. It was merely carried further, diffused into the wider world, becoming the subtle, guiding influence that would shape the centuries to come. There is a profound, almost poetic irony in their disappearance. By losing their national form, they became something universal. They ceased to be a kingdom bound by borders and became a concept bound by memory. They are the wanderers of the spirit, the reminder that identity is a living, breathing thing that must be cultivated, protected, and fought for every single day. We are all, in a sense, searching for our own lost tribes, looking for that sense of wholeness, that feeling of being part of a larger, coherent story that makes sense of our brief time under the sun. As we close this chapter, do not think of the 10 tribes as truly lost. Think of them as the eternal reminder that the things we cherish most are the most fragile. The unity we enjoy today, the bonds we share with those closest to us, the values that define our lives, these are not givens. They are delicate constructions that require constant stewardship. If we let our focus shift, if we let our petty grievances become larger than our common purpose, we too risk the same dissolution. We risk finding ourselves in a world where the connections that defined us have faded, leaving us to wonder where the strength we once possessed has gone. The story of the 12 tribes is ultimately a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, even in the depths of exile, even in the heart of the great, impersonal empires that sought to erase them. The ember of their identity survived. It burned in the songs they sang in secret, in the traditions they passed from father to son, and in the enduring, stubborn belief that they were part of a promise that could never be fully broken. So, as you step away from this history, take with you this final reflection. The lost were never truly extinguished. They were transformed. They became a reminder that our true strength is not found in the lands we occupy or the power we wield, but in the fidelity we hold for one another. We are the inheritors of that ancient struggle. We are the ones who must choose, in every generation, whether we will allow our own bonds to fray or whether we will hold them tight against the coming night. The tribes are gone, yes, but the question they left behind remains, echoing through the halls of time. Will you hold to what defines you, or will you let it slip into the shadows? The choice, as it has always been, is entirely yours. Keep your flame, hold your brothers close, and remember that even in the greatest of disappearances, the truth of who we are can never be completely forgotten.